I have noticed that modern science is in serious trouble, but how much unquestioning faith do you and others have in it? When you hear of a conflict between faith and science, have you considered the possibility that it might not just be faith that is on the defensive, but that modern science might also need to be critically examined? Hi, I'm Kirk, and I'm a scientist and a philosopher and a person who spends a lot of time thinking about the why questions in life. So if you're interested in discussions pertaining to God, science, and life, then please subscribe to my channel here where I'll be posting on a regular basis. You can also subscribe to my social media accounts, and the links are below. My love for sci-fi literature led me to study physics and mechanical engineering in university, and I absolutely loved it. During those years, I had some interesting summer jobs, including one with a geological survey and another with National Defense Research, writing software to detect Soviet submarines. From my work with National Defense, I knew that an effect produced by an intelligence often left behind a signature which could be detected and described in terms of digital information. It was this very phenomenon that enabled us to write software to detect Soviet submarines. I also knew that the genomes of life were packed with digital information, and it looked to have the fingerprints of intelligence all over it. That digital information is slowly becoming corrupted over time, as is inevitable for all information storage devices. But the signature is still very detectable and functional. My curiosity to explore this further led me to a PhD program in biophysics, where I focused on ways to detect and quantify functional information in biopolymers such as proteins, DNA, and RNA, and figure out its role in terms of the submolecular structure of proteins. Although I've gone on to focus on other things in my career, I am still involved in scientific research on the side, currently working with a small team of scientists to further develop what I did in my research. All this to say is that science has been a major part of my life, but remember how I said before that modern science is in serious trouble? How could I say that given my background? First, have you ever experienced any conflict between faith and science? How much do you assume that science is just fine and it is faith that needs to adjust? Have you ever encountered anything in science that seems a bit troubling to you? Does all modern science seem like one monolithic bastion of truth to you, or do some aspects of science seem solid and other aspects seem more like creative storytelling? Just as you may have questioned your faith in God, in the same way, have you questioned your faith in science? Let me share with you something that I have found very revealing. Modern science can be divided into three main categories. The first category is experimental science. This is what I would call the gold standard of science. You can have a theory, suggest a way to experimentally test some predictions that your theory makes, and you get real results that can be checked and tested by other people. The results are testable and repeatable. You might be surprised to learn that although I have been involved in the sciences for many years, I have not yet found any conflict between faith and this gold standard type of science, experimental science. Unfortunately, even experimental science has become substantially corrupted in certain areas. In 2012, an article was published in the journal Nature, probably the most prestigious science journal in the world. The article revealed that out of 53 landmark papers in cancer research, the findings in 89% of them could not be replicated. The same journal published another article 5 years later stating that failure to replicate published findings is the norm. Let's pause for a few seconds and think about the implications of that phrase, the norm. There are areas of science today where the majority of papers have fallen prey to what the journal Nature calls perverse incentives, which include competition for funding, academic prestige coupled with political, media, and cultural pressure. I have collected 58 articles on this problem. If you want to know which areas of science suffer the most from these perverse incentives, follow the money. The top areas of funding today are cancer research, climate science, and immunology and pandemics. As far as political, media, and cultural pressure goes, Researchers in the area of immunology, climate science, and in psychology, anything to do with studies in sexuality, experience enormous pressure to produce the results required by our culture and to not publish results where severe backlash and even defunding may swiftly result. Thus, even experimental science has been corrupted by what we might call human nature with its perverse incentives. So the question to ask yourself before you accept a peer-reviewed paper as the gospel truth is whether or not the results have been replicated by other independent researchers. Examine their data and methodology closely to look for possible flaws. The second major category of modern science is inferential science. During my summer job with the Geological Survey, I watched as different geologists stood on some particular outcrop and debated what had happened there over geological time. Nobody could actually test out their theories, since it's impossible to move around massive chunks of rock the size of large cities. I call this inferential science because you start with observable facts and then infer a conclusion that you can't actually reproduce in a lab because of the degree of difficulty or even the impossibility of testing the conclusion. In inferential science, we take an inductive leap from known facts to a possible conclusion. Sometimes the leap is quite small. For example, forensic science begins with the evidence and attempts to reconstruct what actually happened. We cannot go back in time to the actual event and watch it reproduced, but we can come to reasonably sound conclusions if the leaps are not too large. For example, if your fingerprints are found in the bank, then maybe you're the one who robbed the safe. There are areas in this category of science where the leaps are huge. For example, we observe that variation is possible for most species, and the results can change over time and in different populations. From that, Darwin inferred that if there are no limits to variation, then all of life could have descended from just one simple organism a long time ago. Since Darwin laid out his thinking, an enormous number of creative stories and scenarios have been produced to explain the origin and diversity of biological life. Thus far, however, science has failed to demonstrate that there are no limits to variation. But this massive inductive leap continues to be accepted despite what appears to be constant falsification of its fundamental premise of unlimited variation. As I mentioned earlier, I have not observed any conflict between faith and experimental science. But I have noticed some possible conflicts between inferential science and faith. The bigger the inductive leap from the facts to the conclusion, or the greater number of leaps required to arrive at that inferred conclusion, the more likely it is that there might be a conflict between faith and the conclusion. So, what is the takeaway for this particular aspect of modern science? First, when you read a science article, I would suggest asking yourself, are these results experimentally verified, or are they the result of an inductive leap? If the conclusions or statements in the article are assumptions, or the result of an inductive leap, how big is that leap and how well is it justified? Another question to ask yourself is, how would you recognize the difference between science and creative storytelling? For example, in a short 2-page science article on the origin of the first species, I counted a total of 28 words and phrases such as presumably, probably, possible, might have, at some time, possible scenario, could have, is conceivable, over time, researchers believe, and so on. These are what I call lack of supporting data phrases used to fill in for the fact that we have no supporting results. This raises another question for you to consider. How do you distinguish between good science and good science fiction? Good science fiction begins with known facts of known science and then builds creative stories or scenarios from there. Precisely what I see going on in an enormous number of science articles today, especially in the origin of life. The third category of modern science today is what we can call fantasy, and, not surprisingly, within which I've also observed a conflict between faith and fantasy. In this category of science, creative storytelling is fully unleashed to produce ideas that simply cannot be tested. A few years ago, an article in the science journal Nature, written by George Ellis, pointed out, for example, that theories of the multiverse are untestable and should not be regarded as science. In another article in Nature, he and cosmologist Joseph Silk argued that multiverse theories, or theories of a universe from nothing, are actually fantasy and a threat to the integrity of physics. Surprisingly, these pieces of fantasy are often treated as science in the popular media simply because it was a scientist who made up the story. But have you considered the possibility that not every creative story invented by scientists is actually good science? Remember, just because a scientist creates a creative scenario, it does not follow that it is science. It is probably better classified as good science fiction. I would like to talk more about this in the next few upcoming videos, but for now, here are some takeaways. First, next time you read a science article, be on the lookout for phrases used such as perhaps, probably, could have, and so forth. Second, next time you run into a conflict between faith and science, ask yourself, what category of science is being talked about? Is it an inference? If so, how big is the leap? How many inductive leaps are required? Are science fiction and creative storytelling involved here? Stay tuned for my next videos dealing with faith and science. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video, or at least found it thought-provoking. And if you did, please share it, or you can leave a comment in the section below. And also, don't forget to hit the like button.